I've seen every movie that Park Chan-wook has made. Well, almost. I've seen every major film that he's made, and I'm a major fan of all of them. So when I saw Decision to Leave was playing in New York City, I knew it was time to ditch the red theme we've had going on and check it out. Normally, I'm not a huge fan of over-the-top violence, grindhouse movies. You might think that Park Chan-wook wouldn't be my cup of tea at all if you've been watching this channel, paying attention to what I like. But I think he's got a great sensibility. Clever, innovative, extreme, but also sensitive, incisive, if a bit cynical perhaps, but shrewd as well. More than anything, Park has a knack for turning the wheels inside your head, taking you someplace unfamiliar, and telling stories that just feel really different from everything else. So has he done it again? Well, sort of. This is unmistakably a Park film, and it delivers on most of these things. It's a good movie, but it also backs things down a notch in a few places. I don't think it hits the highs of something like The Handmaiden. I'll tell you exactly why. You might be a little bit disappointed by Decision to Leave, actually. But first, I want to talk about highlights, and there are a lot of them, because this is a good movie. It's a lot of fun to watch, and I think I would recommend it in general. Decision to Leave is probably Park's funniest movie. If you thought that The Handmaiden was too stuffy, or esoteric, or serious, dour, downcast, then you'll be happy to know that this isn't really any of those things. This is a police procedural set in the present, almost a buddy comedy at times. It's got a lot of jokes, of course. The jokes are a bit dark. Some of the humor is basically slapstick, but it has a knowing undertone. Without being didactic, Park pokes at some social conventions, at assumptions, at biases, at the crisp facts of life, like grannies being old. Humor often pokes at society a little bit. Humor often reverses the assumptions we have in our heads, so this isn't crazy. But there is a certain way in which Park just has a touch of a master craftsman, or somebody really wise, things he seems to be pointing out a little bit. Like I said, I think this is his funniest movie. There are some really hilarious jokes. Decision to Leave is also a very unpredictable movie, and this is another place where you can really feel that there's a master at work. Some of the main elements of this movie aren't too complicated, and maybe you've even seen them before in other movies. But it's really hard to know which way things are going to turn out. Park even goes as far as to really fake out the audience a few times. There's a couple of scenes where he basically toys with you, setting up what seems like an inevitable outcome. You can almost hear the words the characters are going to say before they say them. You can see exactly how they're going to move. You can predict exactly what the next shot is going to be. But then something else happens. You can tell that Park really understands how the audience is going to experience his movie, what's going to go on inside of their head. Not common at all. Like I said, the mark of a master craftsman. And I think he manipulates the plot at even higher levels, too. Some of these scenes I mentioned, where you think you know what's going to happen, they're kind of set up like they're going to be big twists or big turning points, big telling moments, but then they aren't exactly that. It's not that it's a twist that goes a different way, but some of the things you think are going to be twists aren't really twists. They just kind of continue with the movie. On the other hand, there are a few twists in the movie that are twists, and they come out of left field, not quite on the beat, not exactly where you would expect them. So not only do the events turn out differently from what you might be thinking, but the plot itself seems to have a different shape than you might expect. This is a slippery movie, a movie that kind of slithers along. It's really fun to be out there. I think, again, this is a hallmark of sort of Park's movies, taking you into different territory, making movies that feel different, and we see it here again. Another thing I like about this movie is how in touch it is with technology. We get some great jokes about cell phones and texting. There's one technological element towards the end of the movie that maybe seems a bit contrived, but otherwise, I think it's a really natural integration of technology into movies, and that's not an easy thing to do. It took people a long time to figure out how to put cell phones into movies in a way that wasn't too gimmicky or too silly or that wasn't destined to be dated. This movie seems to get it right, I think. Of course, this movie also has great style. Cinematography from out of left field, all kinds of weird techniques. Name interesting technique, it's in this movie. Really cool music as well. Again, a movie made by a master craftsman. This is what you would expect. That said, I don't think that this is actually a step past any of Park's other films. I think the music in The Handmaiden, for instance, is better. The cinematography in Stoker, I think, is a bit more precise. I know not everybody loved that movie, but the tactile, the feel of it, the precision of the way that it's put together, edited and shot, is almost unparalleled, I think. The opening credits of a movie like I'm a Cyborg, but That's Okay. You know, Park was in a weird opening credits phase earlier on in his career. That was an example. And those kind of gimmicks rival any of the kind of weird stylistic gimmicks that we have in this movie. Some of the stylistic things in this movie, yeah, they're kind of gimmicks. They're kind of fun. I think, you know, like I said, still a great movie, but does it push the boundary past what we've seen before from Park? I don't know. And we've gotten maybe a bit used to Park doing exactly that, pushing the boundaries. Okay. Before we really get into downsides, there's a few more neutral things that I thought I'd mention. These are things that are just kind of interesting. For instance, this movie is kind of its own sequel. It could almost be half the length that it is, and it would be relatively complete, but it keeps going. And I think this kind of thing is getting more and more common. 3-act structure is out the window in 2022. 7-act structure is in. False endings are in. A lot of newer movies seem to ditch the idea of a single self-contained plot arc. Maybe this is because a lot of these smaller self-contained ideas have already been done, or maybe it's the influence of television. Yikes. To be clear, I'm putting this in the neutral category. I think the movie works fine. I don't really love this more extended plot form, but it's pretty common. A lot of new movies, yeah. It's not exactly that they drag on, but they have a lot of episodes in them. There are some, maybe, consequences of this. Like, there's a fairly large jump of time in the movie. We skip forward 13 months at one point. And maybe this feels a little bit cheap. There are a few characters and plot lines that get left behind, a few things that aren't really explained, some juicy interpersonal moments that would have occurred in those months that we don't get to see. For instance, the first assistant detective person, a relatively strong character, it just kind of disappears from the movie. There's some loose ends that aren't really, there's some storylines that aren't really tied up, and some things we maybe miss out on that. Like I said, that jump maybe just a little bit cheap. Another interesting thing about this movie is that in its political undertones, I guess, it doesn't feel exactly like a Western movie from 2022. And of course, it isn't. Park, historically, though, has had pretty good roles for women. In this movie, I think the tradition kind of ends. The main woman in this movie, Shiore, I don't know how to pronounce that, is a compelling character and really well portrayed. But there's a way in which, I don't know, the linchpin of the plot is more or less whether or not you can trust her. That's kind of the big question. And like I said, it's very hard to predict, but if you think about the logic that's going on here, it's kind of a question of whether or not she's benevolent but foolish, or malicious and ingenious. And to me, this just feels a little bit played out, especially when you toss in a slightly dicey relationship, workplace relationship, that is to some degree embraced by the film. You know, to some degree, it's maybe a downfall, but it's to some degree embraced. This movie starts to feel a bit like a noir from the 40s. These are kind of subtle things. I don't think this movie is regressive, and I'm not trying to campaign against it. I'm not trying to make any kind of political point here, but I will say that it feels a little old in some ways. It feels a little clunky. In some ways, it doesn't really feel like some new forward-thinking things. And some of Park's other movies, like The Handmaiden, really have. Maybe there's some debate about that movie, I don't know. But that said, there is a character in the second part of the movie, the second detective assistant person, actually. And this is a character that you probably wouldn't find in the movie from 10 years ago, direct evidence of 2022 being when the movie came out or whatever. Otherwise, though, I kind of think that Decision to Leave could have come out in 2009, and maybe that's not too surprising in some ways. That was a golden age for Park. This starts to get towards one of my first real criticisms of the movie, I think. Like I said, I'm not making a political campaign against it, but it starts to hint at something that maybe did bother me a little bit. Like I said, Park Chan-wook has made a career out of making really different films. He's made movies that basically nobody else could make. And in some ways, this feels like that. Like I said, it's unpredictable, and it does operate way out in new territory. But it's definitely not as wild as most of his previous work. And a number of the main elements actually feel kind of pedestrian. Like I said, this is a police procedural. It reminds me a bit of Memories of Murder at time, Bong Joon-ho's great thriller. We've got police stories here, detectives becoming involved with suspects. We've seen this kind of stuff before. Now, to be fair, Park does kind of abstract over some of these themes in a way. This isn't a straight-up procedural. It's not a straightforward movie. There's a certain subversive angle to it, I guess, but that only goes so far. So one way to look at this, I guess, is that it just isn't as extreme a movie, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because most of Park's films are really out there, really violent, not really something that everyone, like my mom, would be interested in. This is a bit more mellow, and it's a bit more funny. So this all sounds great, and maybe for some people, this is a much more approachable, much more sane, and much more fun film. But I think it's also maybe a little bit more derivative, and that isn't so great. And for people who are expecting something like The Handmaiden, or Thirst, or I'm a Cyborg But That's Okay, or Old Boy, or Stoker, or really just about anything Park has made, this is a bit different. Of course, all those movies that I just listed are also a bit different from each other, and if you throw in JSA, one of his earliest films, then we've really got a lot of variance in his career. I think the biggest thing that I noticed about this movie, besides that it maybe just doesn't feel quite as, it doesn't seem like it's pushing the boundaries quite as much as Park does, is that it also, to me, felt, I guess, a little bit pointless. Now, Park's movies aren't exactly didactic, and they've never been intellectual. But I guess I felt differently about things like Handmaiden or Stoker, at least. Of course, another piece of the story is that my tastes have changed a lot since I watched a lot of Park's earlier films. I mainly got into his work when I was in high school, a while ago. And that was a time when I thought about movies in a very different way. And maybe I wouldn't be enamored by his earlier films either if I watched them now. I'm pretty sure I'd still think The Handmaiden is great. And that came out when I was in college, so a little bit more recent. But to some extent, my tastes have shifted. So take this with a grain of salt. But I also think that this movie is a bit lighter in some ways than his past films. There are hints of substance here and there. The movie definitely has wisdom in it. It definitely has a lot of life experience in it. It's shrewd. And it makes pointed jokes and it has pointed twists, but they don't really coalesce into anything, I guess. There's some interesting elements, like the wife that works at a nuclear power plant. She's the youngest ever plant operator. We see this in a newspaper clipping or something, and this is a great way to characterize her, to introduce us to a character who's maybe stiff in a certain way, very academic in a certain way, rule follower, clean, sterile. Great moment. And maybe there's also some sort of sly joke about certain cultural values as well. The nuclear power plant is in the background a little bit in this movie, but that's kind of it. It doesn't really seem to lead to much. Another interesting piece in this movie is that it contains some clips from other films in it, movies playing on televisions, characters watching movies, people talking about movies, older Korean films mainly, and I don't really have enough context to know exactly the significance here. The movie does invoke the cinematic thing a little bit, and that feels kind of significant given that it's also playing off of pretty standard tropes with the police procedural stuff. It's kind of interesting, actually. The police procedural has a slightly odd structure, and probably deliberate, has this structure where when we first come to the movie, the detectives are still investigating a previous crime. We never really learn that much about the previous crime. We see a little bit of it. But they keep getting pulled off of their current assignment, the one the movie's really about, to go work on this other thing. It's kind of interesting. Like there's some distraction, something that's always sort of reaching in and pulling them back. Why is that? I don't know. Like I said, in some ways it feels like with the comedy, and maybe with some of these oddities of the structure, and maybe with some of the cinematics that go on, maybe Park is trying to abstract over the genre a little bit, and maybe there's something here, but it just doesn't really lead to much. We have also some themes of surveillance, some ideas about how technology can reconfigure society, how technology allows you to cheat on your wife, how it allows you to create kind of weird, new, one-directional relationships. Maybe you could say this movie is in tune with the great modern pastime of stalking people on Instagram, surveillance, stalking, and the relationships they lead to. This ties in very closely with some of the innovative stylistic elements in the film, too. If you watch the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's something there. There are ideas in this movie, but they just don't really seem to coalesce into much. And I'm not saying that this needs to be some intellectual movie, but it does feel a little bit less salient than some of Park's others' work. And to be fair, it's a mismatch for what I'm interested in these days and for what I mainly talk about on this channel. So overall, I would still say that this is a good movie. There were definitely moments where I got revved up, where I got really excited to be watching a Park Chan-wook movie again. That's great. But honestly, I left the theater feeling a little bit underwhelmed. When I've sat down to watch Park's other movies, I've been expecting something earth-shattering, something radically new, something that raises the level of world cinema. And I think Decision to Leave falls a bit short in that regard. Perhaps it's just a victim of his other amazing work. You get the feeling that maybe he just needed to make some money when he was making this movie. Still a great movie, but does it hit the highs? Maybe not. Anyway, let me know what you think if you've seen this movie, and otherwise I will see you next week.